Hey there, welcome to another episode of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and today I'm not actually going to be talking about any toys that are in my collection, but I'm going to be talking about some toys that I wish were in my collection. If you watched my last episode, I did a list of the top 15 Masters of the Universe Classics figures that were not based on the vintage Masters of the Universe toy line. And I had the idea to do that episode over a year ago, because when I first started this channel and I was trying to come up with ideas on things I could talk about, I came up with a bunch of lists and I printed them all off. The only thing is I kept buying new toys and I kept showing you my new stuff that I never really got around to doing all these lists that I had done up. So I did the Masters Universe list in my last episode, and it's doing pretty well. It's got a lot of views and whatnot. So I thought, well, maybe I'll revisit some of these other lists. And there's another reason for me doing these lists, is that normally when I'm doing videos involving action figures, so if I have a new one, I go and I dig out all the old versions of that figure, and I like to be able to do comparisons for you guys, so you can see how the character has evolved from previous incarnations. And you usually don't see it on camera, but I'm crawling all around. I'm on my hands and knees getting figures out from the back of the shelf over there. I'm in my crawl space going through buckets. I'm up on a step ladder getting toys from high up on shelves. So I'm constantly pulling things out and around in order to give you guys, an entertaining video. Well, this week I had some pain in my side and I went to the emergency room and they told me I had a really big kidney stone and that I needed to have it removed surgically. So I assumed they were going to get a little slice in my side and remove the stone laparoscopically, but that's not how they do it. They go in, in a very unpleasant manner, and they're supposed to zap the stone. And so, last Thursday I went in for surgery. They put me under. I woke up and they told me they actually didn't get the stone, but they put basically a tube in me to kind of allow me to, I don't even want to talk about that. I've got a tube in me right now, and I have to go back for surgery next week. So I'm dealing with a lot of discomfort and still some pain as well. So I really cannot be crawling around on the floor, climbing ladders, digging into shelves. So I wanted to do an episode for you guys because I'm kind of just sitting around doing nothing. But it's very hard to move around. So I thought this is a perfect time to do one of these lists, because some of the lists I'd done up were wish lists for figures that I wish had been created. So I have 3 lists here that I originally envisioned as 3 separate episodes. But I think I can probably just mash them all up into one episode. And so what we've got here is, I'll give you a very quick history of G.I. Joe if you're not familiar with it. So, G.I. Joe, of course, started off as a 12-inch doll in like the 60s or 70s. And so that figure went on for a while, but that was before my time. I grew up a child of the 80s, so I was introduced to G.I. Joe, what is known as a Real American Hero, or RAH. So the RAH G.I. Joes, sometimes called the vintage figures, whatever, they're the little 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joes. They're known for having the elastic waistband in their stomach, which allows them, they were a lot more posable than old Star Wars figures of the same size. And they had elbows and knees that Star Wars figures didn't have. So they were pretty revolutionary at the time. Unfortunately, those little elastics that hold them together have eroded over time, and a lot of vintage G.I. Joe figures are now broken in two because that elastic has rotted away. So I have a pretty big collection of RAH G.I. Joes from my youth, except none of them are on display because most of them, they're broken in half or their knees are really wobbly and they can't really stand up on their own. So unfortunately, they're all just in bins. Then that G.I. Joe Real American Hero line basically ran from 1982 up to 1994. Now, I didn't collect it right until the end. I collected from 82 up to about 1990, and then I kind of lost interest. And then they did put out a couple other little lines of G.I. Joe, which weren't very successful in the years that followed. The next big resurgence of G.I. Joe came in 2002, when Hasbro put a really big push on G.I. Joe again. You know, they flooded store shelves. They put out a couple of like CG animated movies to support it, and they came up with a new figure design. Now, they were still 3 3/4 inches, and initially they didn't have the elastic waistband, and people didn't like that because they wanted figures that were compatible with the old figures. So this era of figures in 2002 doesn't have an official name, I guess. Like, where the original ones are called Real American Hero, that's pretty accurate because that's what the packaging said. But with the 2002 era, it was first called G.I. Joe versus Cobra, then they called it Valor versus Venom, then they called it Spy Troops. But to kind of encompass all those years together, kind of what the fandom has decided is to just call that era the New Sculpt era, because the sculpts were new and they didn't quite match up with the vintage line. Now, that doesn't really work because now we're beyond the New Sculpt era, so it seems kind of weird to call it the New Sculpt. And then in 2007, Hasbro launched a new line of figures. They're still supposed to be 3 3/4 inches, but they're more like 4 inches. They're more highly detailed. And those figures became known as the modern era of G.I. Joes. And those figures ran for a good decade, from 2007 right up till about 2018. We might have even got a couple of figures rolling into 2019. But that line is now over as well. So I was a big fan of the vintage stuff when I was a kid. I was a big fan of the New Sculpt stuff when I was in my early 20s. And the modern stuff is, I kind of went full on into it. I kind of had the most disposable income at this point. I started buying kind of rare convention exclusive figures. I was really trying to get a complete set. So I have a whole lot of G.I. Joes in the modern style, probably more than either of the previous incarnations. And so when that line was winding down, when I made these lists. And so the lists I made here is the top 15 Real American Hero era G.I. Joe figures that we need in the modern era. Because they remade a lot of the vintage figures, but they didn't get around to making all of them. And there was a couple of characters that I really would have liked to have seen redone in the modern era, because my G.I. Joe shelves just don't really feel complete without them. Then I also have a list for the top 15 New Sculpt characters needed in the modern era. Now, a lot of fans kind of ignore the New Sculpt years because that New Sculpt was kind of gangly and the proportions were kind of weird, and it was kind of geared towards children, and so a lot of adult collectors, just didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. But there was some really cool stuff in those years, and even though they revisited some of those characters in the modern era, it was really only a handful of them, and the New Sculpt era was largely ignored. So yeah, there's easily 15 characters I could name, probably a lot more, that I wish had been redone in the modern style. And then the last list I've got here is top 15 unproduced figures needed in the modern era. And when I say unproduced, these are characters that are part of the G.I. Joe mythology that have never had an action figure. There was a lot of important characters in the G.I. Joe mythology that never had action figures, such as Cobra Commander's son Billy, and the character Big Lob, who was from the 1987 G.I. Joe animated movie, as one of the main characters. So these characters that played such a big role in the movies and the comic books, they didn't have any representation until the modern era. So we've got a Billy figure now, we've got a Big Lob figure now, we've got a Pythona figure now. These characters probably would have been maybe the top 3 on my list of unproduced characters. But even with those key characters now being made, there's still a bunch more that we're missing. So here I go. I'm just going to run through these lists. I'll maybe talk about each character a little bit. I'll be able to just pull up a kind of a stock image of them just to keep this a little more interesting so you're not just staring at me talking. But yeah, I'm not going to go out and dig out the old Real American Hero versions or the new sculpt versions, even though I might have a lot of those figures, I kind of just need to sit and chill out for now. So that's what we're going to do. So yeah, let's start with the top 15 Real American Hero figures needed in the modern era. Okay, so the number 15 spot I gave to Tiger Force Tripwire. Now, generally, I would always want new characters. Like, sometimes Hasbro does some really cool repaints of existing characters, but if I had the choice between a repaint of a character I already have or a brand new character, 9.5 out of 10 times I will take the brand new character. The reason Tripwire makes this list is because in the vintage toy line, there was regular Tripwire who wore green, and then there was Tiger Force Tripwire who had kind of a tiger stripe motif, which the whole Tiger Force sub-team had. And Tiger Force was made up of previously released figures with this new tiger deco on them. And I only had 2 Tiger Force characters as a kid. I had Roadblock and Tripwire. My older brother, Doug, had pretty much all the rest of them. So I really kind of had an attachment to those Tiger Force 2 characters, Roadblock and Tripwire. And in the modern era of figures, the G.I. Joe Collectors Club, they tended to make a lot of Tiger Force characters. They seem to be fans of that sub-team. So even though Hasbro didn't release a lot of the Tiger Force ones at retail, the Collectors Club picked up the slack and made all these convention exclusives and stuff using Tiger Force repaints. And not only did they give us new versions of all the old Tiger Force members, but also they gave us redos of European Tiger Force figures that were never released in the States. So they really went deep into like the Tiger Force history. And yet we didn't get a Tiger Force Tripwire, one of the 2 figures that I would have wanted. I actually really like the color deco for the vintage Tiger Force Tripwire. So yeah, my Tiger Force collection, even though it's much larger now than it ever was when I was a kid, it seems like it's missing one of the most important elements because I don't have Tiger Force Tripwire over there with those guys. So yeah, that's why he's in my number 15 spot. At number 14, I've got Heat Viper version 2. Now, I actually didn't have this figure when I was a kid, but I did have Heat Viper version 1, and it was one of my favorite Cobra Troopers. I just loved the kind of weird, asymmetrical look of his helmet and the kind of crazy yellow and purple colors. Great figure. My little brother had Heat Viper version 2, which was almost weirder because, again, it had a weird helmet. He was bright green, which didn't seem to make sense for a Heat Viper that had like a flamethrower. But just because he had the name Heat Viper and I had such a fondness for the original one, I was always kind of a fan of that Heat Viper version 2. And when my little brother kind of grew up and lost interest in G.I. Joes, that was one of the ones I was eager to kind of snag from him. And I would have liked to seen that version 2 in the modern era because we did get a version 1. But yeah, version 2 would have been nice as well. In the number 13 spot, I have Colonel Courage. Now this is another figure I didn't have as a kid, so I don't have a ton of nostalgic attachment to him. But again, my little brother had him, so he was around the house. And again, it's a figure that I inherited from my little brother when he had kind of moved on from playing with toys. So, and just the fact that guys like Colonel Courage and Heat Viper are on my list, it gives you an idea of how deep Hasbro went in the modern era, because my attachment is mostly to characters from the early years of G.I. Joe, and most of those characters did get remade in the modern era, so I don't need a ton of figures from my youth. So I kind of had to look at some of the figures that were cool, but kind of came after I'd stopped collecting. Number 12, I've got Snow Serpent version 2. Very similar to the Heat Viper. I had Snow Serpent version 1 when I was a kid. That was the version that's kind of the most iconic that appeared in the cartoons and everything. So when Hasbro started the modern era, of course, they redid the Snow Serpent version 1 that everybody knows. But the Snow Serpent version 2 was pretty cool too. I didn't have it as a kid because it came out after I'd stopped collecting, but my little brother had it. I really liked the look of it, and yeah, I think it would have looked pretty cool in the modern style. Number 11, now this one's kind of a reverse of that. So in the vintage line, they first put out a character called Toxo Viper in, I don't know, I want to say 87 or 88. And I really liked that Toxo Viper figure. He was kind of weird looking. He had this big gas mask that kind of looked like a duck bill or something. Anyway, I loved that figure. And then after I stopped buying vintage G.I. Joes, they put out a Toxo Viper version 2. He was also pretty cool looking, but he looked quite different from the version 1. So then in the modern era, one of the convention box sets had Toxo Vipers in it, and you actually got 3 of them, but they based it on the later version, the version 2 from the 90s, instead of the 80s version, which was pretty odd, because usually the club would always kind of aim for the nostalgic rather than kind of the later stuff. So I'm still missing Toxo Viper version 1, and I really like to get that in the modern era. Number 10 is Headhunter. Now, Headhunter, this again, my little brother had these figures because it came just after I stopped collecting. But they introduced kind of a drug element into the G.I. Joe line. So they had the DEF, the Drug Elimination Force, which were the G.I. Joe sub-team, and they fought against a drug dealer named Headman, and he had a bunch of henchmen called the Headhunters. And they had these very cool designs with just this gold faceplate and a little beret on top, which were really cool. And I really do wish we got those in the modern era because they would have looked great. Number 9, I've got Overlord. Now, Overlord, again, he's not a character I ever had, and he's not even a character my little brother had, but he was kind of a new, kind of big bad introduced into G.I. Joe after I stopped collecting. Because you always had the Cobra High Command that had Cobra Commander, Destro, Baroness, and then you had a bunch of like low-level henchmen. But Overlord was supposed to be kind of a new Cobra Elite. And so, yeah, and he had kind of a unique design with a weird design with like a monocle and a weird helmet. And anyway, he's somebody that I think would have been really cool to have added into the modern line. And unfortunately, that's never happened. At number 8, we had Target. Now, this was a trooper, one of the generic soldiers, but he wasn't a member of Cobra. He was a member of Destro's sub-team, the Iron Grenadiers. And I didn't own the vintage Target. My brother Doug did, my older brother, which me and my brother Doug, we almost shared our collection. So with my little brother Brian, his stuff was kind of separate, and he played with his toys with his friends. But me and Doug, we always played together. So Target was a character that was, really entrenched in our big battles that we had when we were kids, and he had a really cool design with this jetpack and everything. So I really wish that we'd gotten him in the modern era. Number 7, I've got Downtown. This was another character that my brother had. He was one of the later ones that we had when we were kids, because I think he came out in 89 or something, which is around the time that we were kind of phasing out of G.I. Joe. And he was like a mortar soldier. He was basically an upgrade to Short Fuse, who was the original mortar trooper in 1982. And Downtown was just a unique character, and he's a character that we had when we were kids, so it's kind of a shame that we don't have him in the modern era. Number 6, I've got Stretcher. Now, neither, me or Doug, we didn't have Stretcher, and I don't think Brian did either, so I didn't have a Stretcher in my household, but he was a G.I. Joe medic. We already had, I owned both Doc and Lifeline that came before Stretcher, but I like the look of Stretcher. He had kind of a unique helmet, kind of headgear on there, and he was like another minority character. It would have been nice to add him to the ranks of the modern era, but unfortunately we didn't get to him. Number 5, I've got the Secto Viper. Now, the Secto Viper was another trooper. He was one I really liked. He was the pilot of the Cobra Bug, which was this big, crazy wheeled submarine vehicle. And kind of like Ace, the G.I. Joe pilot, Secto Viper had this clear dome that went over his head, and you could take that off. It was a really cool figure, kind of the bright yellow design, the dome helmet. Looked really cool. I wish we had gotten an update of him. Number 4. Now, this is a big one. This is Lightfoot. So this is probably the last of the named G.I. Joes that I personally had in my collection that I never got in the modern era. It's one thing to be missing out on a trooper, even if it was a really cool looking trooper, but to be missing out on a named G.I. Joe that I had in my collection as a kid, I was really hoping that the the Collectors Club would get around to putting out a version of Lightfoot because they filled in a couple other important slots for me right before they wound down. So characters like Fast Draw and Rampart, they managed to get those characters done, but we never got around to Lightfoot, so that's a real shame. Number 3, I've got another Cobra Trooper, the Hydro Viper. Now, my brother Doug owned Hydro Viper when we were kids, but he was just a really cool design. He was kind of like a genetically modified Cobra diver, and he had these webbed fingers, and he had this mask that made him look like a sea monster of some sort. It was a really cool design. It was kind of a weird design, but yeah, I really dug it, and I bet if they get around to redoing that helmet and everything in the modern style, it would have been really cool. So a shame we didn't get him. And then in my number 2 and number 1 spot, these might be controversial to some, but in that animated movie that came out in 87, 88, they introduced Cobra La, which was this ancient race of bug and snake people that lived in the Antarctic, and it was revealed that they had sent Cobra Commander to Earth to like wage war on the humans, and he was sent to kind of clear a path so that Cobra La could rise again and take over the planet. It was this whole weird sci-fi element of G.I. Joe that had not even been hinted at in the previous cartoons and stuff. So this just kind of came out of left field that we learned that Cobra Commander was an ancient snake person. It was weird. And a lot of people really didn't like it. And there's part of me that doesn't like it either, because I liked the comic books. They were much more grounded. In the comic books, Cobra Commander was just a used car salesman that was disenfranchised, and he started this terrorist organization. Like, it was much more real world. But in the cartoon, they went with this crazy snake society named Cobra La. And in the modern era of G.I. Joe, they gave us one of the members of Cobra La. Well, let me just backtrack a minute. So when that movie came out, they put out a 3-pack of Cobra La characters. So there was the leader, Globulus. Then there was his main henchman, the Nemesis Enforcer, who had these big bat wings. And then there was the Royal Guard, who was basically kind of just like a bug-like trooper. And in the movie, there was a 4th character who was very prominent named Pythona. And so they put out this 3-pack of figures with Globulus, Nemesis Enforcer, and the Royal Guard, but we never get a Pythona. And she probably had the most speaking lines of any of them in the cartoon, and it always seemed like a real crime we never got her. So, fortunately, the Collectors Club did make the first ever Pythona figure, which I showed you earlier. And also, in just the regular series of figures, Hasbro produced Nemesis Enforcer, the big henchman guy with the bat wings. So, if they were going to go into it at all and give us those 2 figures, I wish they'd completed the set. So, in my number 2 spot, I have the Royal Guard. I always loved the look of this guy and his big, crazy bladed weapon. I would think he would have been awesome in the modern era. And my number 1 spot goes to Globulus. So he is the weird guy with the snake body. The vintage figure is probably the weirdest G.I. Joe out of the Real American Hero era, because he was a normal G.I. Joe from the waist up, but then from the waist down, he had this rubbery snake body. It was just really bizarre. And yeah, I was really hoping they would make one in the modern era, kind of using the same technology that Boss Fight Studio did with their Medusa figures, where they gave us a kind of a segmented body and you could coil the snake body around and the figure could still stand up. I was really hoping maybe that Hasbro would license that kind of sculpt from Boss Fight, give us a Globulus. They never did, and it's probably a slim chance we'll ever get an updated Globulus figure, which kind of sucks because he's kind of cool. And yeah, so that is my list of the Real American Hero figures that I wish we'd got in the modern era. All right, so I'll jump right into the next list. So this is the top 15 new sculpt era G.I. Joes that I would have liked to have seen in the modern era style. So at number 15, I have the Skull Squad Trooper / Coil Trooper. So I've kind of stuck 2 of them in one spot. These are figures that came out in one of the Collectors Club box sets, in which the Coil, which is Serpentor's little sub-team within Cobra, they had their own troopers, and Major Blood had his own squad of mercenaries as well. And so yeah, this was the first time we'd seen either of these characters, and yeah, they were both pretty neat, and I didn't get any of those figures from that set. So that makes me want them even more in the modern era since I never got the new sculpt versions. So yeah, both of them would have been cool, and I kind of mashed them together just because they were in the same set, but that is a bit of a cheat. And I'm going to cheat again for my number 14 spot. So I've got Gallows and Grimskull. So these guys came out right near the very end of the new sculpt era, and they're really cool figures. And they're basically very similar. One guy had kind of a red helmet, the other guy had a yellow helmet. These guys were supposedly characters that had graduated from the regular ranks of Cobra. One of them was a Saw Viper and one of them was a Sand Viper. And they were the first members of the Cobra Plague, which was a concept introduced in the G.I. Joe comic books being published by Devil's Due at the time. Basically, the idea was that G.I. Joe started off as a team of like 13 elite soldiers. So Cobra Commander now, he wanted to take, an elite team of 13. So he pulled members from all of his different ranks. So one Laser Viper and one Cobra Eel and one Snow Serpent. And he kind of gave them their own code name and elevated them and called them the Plague. And unfortunately, that storyline never really got to play out the way I imagine Devil's Due wanted it to, because they lost the license to make G.I. Joe comic books. And they started making the Plague. I imagine the original plan was to give us all 13 members, but they only ever produced the 2 of them, and then it fizzled out. So that was a cool concept that I would have liked to have seen revisited. So yeah, Gallows and Grimskull would have been cool. In the number 13 spot, I've got Med Alert. So like Stretcher, this was another G.I. Joe medic, and I just liked his design. He had kind of a cool orange outfit, similar to Lifeline in a lot of ways, but he was just a guy I liked. Now, unfortunately, these characters, they never got very well fleshed out, because if they even appeared in there was no ongoing cartoon. There was those animated movies. I don't recall Med Alert ever being featured in them, and most of these characters never saw the light of the day in the comic book either. So it's really just kind of based on their file cards and the look of the figure. And just so happens Med Alert was a cool figure, so I wish we had an updated version of him. Number 12, the Night Creeper. So the Night Creeper is a Cobra ninja that was introduced in the Real American Hero era, and that original Night Creeper was redone in the modern era. But the Night Creeper had a whole new look in the new sculpt era, which is quite different. And the figure was kind of goofy. It was one of those ones that suffered from weird proportion issues. But I did like the look of him. And I think if they'd taken that design and done it in the modern style, we could have ended up with a really cool new version of the Night Creeper. So yeah, it also came in a bunch of different color varieties. So if they had actually got around to sculpting that figure in the new style, they could have released it in all the different colors, and that would have been pretty cool too. Number 11, this is another weird one, kind of like Cobra La, but this is Venomous Maximus. So he was a new leader of Cobra that was created, sort of like how they created Serpentor in the vintage cartoons and comic books. In this era, they kidnapped General Hawk, the leader of G.I. Joe, and mutated him into Venomous Maximus so he would be Cobra's leader. And it was kind of a goofy idea, and he was kind of a goofy looking character, but he was a new character. He was different looking. I'm sure if they made him in the modern era, it would have been a lot more successful than the new sculpt toy that they gave us, because the proportions were a little weird with that figure and everything. So I kind of liked him. I kind of wish we got him. At number 10, I've got Major Barrage. There's not a whole lot to say about this guy. He was another figure that came out right at the end of the new sculpt era, and you can actually kind of see in that figure how they were bridging it into the more detailed modern era figures. Like, he's kind of the missing link between them, I would say. Like, he's a little bit taller. Just the sculpting on him is really nice. There's not a whole lot to say about the character. Like, he's kind of a clean slate, I guess. But I do like his kind of basic military design, and I wish we'd got him in the modern era. Number 9, I've got the Swamp Rat. Now, this is another one of Cobra's genetically modified troopers, and it's kind of a goofy figure. We got it in at least 2 different colors. There was kind of a tan one and then a green and black one. I didn't really have a preference to which one we got, but if they had made one in the modern era, I would have liked to have got it in both colors. And I bet the modern era design probably would have elevated it from the kind of goofy look that it had in the modern era. Number 8, I've got Crocmaster version 2. So Crocmaster, he was one of these kind of eccentric Cobra characters introduced in the vintage line. He had this full black mask with this kind of breather on him, and he wrangled crocodiles. So in the modern era, they did remake that vintage Crocmaster figure, and it turned out pretty well. But in the New Sculpt era years, there was a whole new Crocmaster, and the file card specifically identified him as a different character. The original Crocmaster had supposedly died, and this guy had replaced him. And he had a whole new look. He still had kind of a breather tube, but instead of a black mask, his face was exposed. And yeah, I really liked him, and it would have been cool to get him in the modern era. Number 7, Coil Crusher. So this is another genetically modified Cobra. If you're seeing a theme there with these, that's because that was the premise behind the Valor versus Venom era of this, within this era. So for the year or two that Valor versus Venom was running, the concept was Cobra was stealing animal DNA and injecting it into their troopers or whatever. So Coil Crusher was a guy that was like mixed with like boa constrictor DNA, and the figure had these arms that were bendy wire arms. So you could kind of wrap them around somebody, and it wasn't all that successful in the little scale figure. But I bet if they had done it in the modern era, it probably would have looked a lot better. But yeah, he was kind of a cool looking character. Number 6, I've got the Televiper. Now the Televiper, if you're a Joe fan, you're familiar with them. These guys they were always in the control room at the Cobra headquarters, and they had these big visors, and for whatever reason, whatever their thoughts were would kind of go across their visor like it was a screen, like a Wall Street or something. Anyway, I never liked the vintage figure very much. I never thought they looked very cool. And we did get modern era versions of those vintage Televipers. And their heads, I found the vintage figure had a really big head. And that kind of carried over into the modern era version. I just don't think either of them look really great. However, in the New Sculpt era, they gave us kind of a revamp of the Televiper in a couple of different colors, actually. And I loved those figures. I thought the Televiper actually looked cool, and I would have liked to get a modern version of the New Sculpt Televiper because it's much better than the vintage one as far as I'm concerned. Number 5, the Meta Viper. So the Meta Viper was a really cool idea. This was because Cobra never had a medic before, but in the comic books, sometimes you'd see these, just random Cobra troopers pulling guys on stretchers or whatever. And so those became known as the Meta Vipers, and they released Meta Viper again in the tail end of the New Sculpt era, and it's one of my favorite figures from the era. And these kind of green scrubs and everything. It's a really cool figure, so it would have been nice to get a new one. And just above him, at number 4, I've got Scalpel, and he was the leader of the Cobra Meta Vipers. So he shared a lot of the similar design elements, except instead of a full face mask, his face is exposed. He had some unique elements to him. And yeah, it just would have been really cool to have the two of them in the modern era. Number 3, the Cobra Moray. So this is another type of Cobra diver. They have a lot of them. The Cobra Eel being the most well-known, the original. But yeah, the Cobra Moray was just kind of this cool new diver that seemed to have replaced the eel, at least initially, in the New Sculpt years. And they released it in a couple of different color schemes. And yeah, I just really liked the look of it. So yeah, it would have been cool to get updated. At number 2, I've got the Cobra Claws. So this is another trooper type. I think they were kind of a heavy weapons type of trooper. I'm not sure. They came out very early on in the first wave of the New Sculpt era in 2002. And the figures suffered from being a little kind of short and squatty. Like, I think they were supposed to be big tough guys to carry these big cannons they came with, but the proportions were a little weird. But that was a problem in the New Sculpt era in general. I think if they'd made these guys in the modern era, they would have been big buff guys and they would have looked really cool. So yeah, number 2 goes to Cobra Claws. And number 1 goes to the Neo Viper. So the Neo Viper, again, was released in the first wave of the New Sculpt era figures, came out in 2002. And this was kind of the new Cobra Trooper, replacing the Cobra Trooper that we all know and love with the blue helmet and the black like balaclava mask. So yeah, this was kind of an update of that. And I just thought this guy looked really great. Like, even though the figure might have had kind of wonky proportions, and initially he had the T crotch instead of the O-ring to hold him together, which pissed a lot of people off. But then they took that same figure and released it again with an O-ring to improve his mobility. And then they released it again in like a half dozen different colors. There was like a yellow one, there was a red one, which was the Neo Viper Commander, a tan one that looked like kind of a desert trooper. Anyway, I loved the Neo Viper. I was really pleased with it as the new trooper, and I was glad to get so many color variations. I actually army built these guys, and I have quite a bit of them, and I was really hoping that they would make it in the modern era, but they didn't. I tried my best to create a modern style one using parts from Marauder Gunrunners, but it's still, I see it and it doesn't quite fit the build. So I wish we'd got updated ones from Hasbro. Okay, so my last list here is my top 15 unproduced G.I. Joe characters that I wanted in the modern era style, because these characters have never had a G.I. Joe figure. So as I mentioned earlier, like Big Lob, Billy, Pythona, Shooter, these were all characters that became really important in the G.I. Joe mythology, either the comic books or the cartoons, and we did get figures of them. So it's great that the Collectors Club and Hasbro filled some of these, holes in our collection that people have been complaining about for years. I don't think anybody on my list is as important as those guys were, but they're all characters I would have liked to have seen. So I'm going to cheat a little bit with number 15. I'm going to say General Ray. So this was a character that was introduced in the Devil's Due comic books. And basically he was a clone of Serpentor that was put in as the G.I. Joe's new commander as kind of a mole. But he ended up being redeemed and becoming a good guy. And he was a character that when he was first introduced in the comic book, I really didn't like him. And they hadn't revealed that he was a bad guy. But by the time that reveal had happened, I'd really grown to like the character. And it's a shame we never got a figure of him. Again, I tried to create one using Marauder Task Force pieces, but it didn't come out that great. So General Ray is my number 15 spot, but I'll put a little asterisk by there. And I actually would have liked to have seen his whole team called the Phoenix Guard, which consisted of a bunch of other Cobra Troopers in disguise. So there was Friday, which was actually Zorana. There was Halo, that was Wild Weasel. High Tide, Copperhead. Mech was Scrap Iron, and Snake Eater was Firefly. So General Ray had this whole team of people that he brought into the G.I. Joe headquarters, and G.I. Joe didn't realize that these were all established Cobra members. So even though we have all those characters in the modern era, we don't have them in their Phoenix Guard outfits, which would have been pretty cool. So maybe that would have been a really cool box set or something at a convention, but unfortunately we never got there. At number 14, I'm going to go with Cool Breeze. Now this was a character that was introduced in the vintage G.I. Joe comic books of the 80s. He was only around for 2 issues, and then he died. So he didn't make a really big impact on G.I. Joe. But just the fact that he died, he kind of did have a big impact on G.I. Joe, because G.I. Joe characters didn't die all that frequently. So to be introduced to a new character, allow him to have a couple lines for us to get to know him even just a little bit and then kill him off, it does give him some significance in the world of G.I. Joe. So it would have been cool to get him. Now, my next spots from 13 all the way up to 8, I just lumped these guys together. And these are the other members of the Plague. So as I mentioned in the New Sculpt era, they gave us Gallows and Grimskull. So these are the other characters that we never got a figure of. So there was Bayonet, who was formerly a Snow Serpent. There was Body Bags, formerly a Range Viper. Velocity, formerly an AVAC. Then there was Infrared, who was formerly a Crimson Guard. Although we did get something called a Shadow Crimson Guard, which was a black version of a Crimson Guard. And that was basically Infrared, so I think I could probably leave him off the list. Then there was Incision, who was a Night Creeper. Vector, who was a Laser Viper. and Vanguard, who was a whole new character introduced in the comic books who didn't come from a previous Cobra ranking. So these figures all would have been really easy to make because in the comic books they basically all shared the same body. It was kind of just like a black turtleneck and black pants and boots. And the only way you could distinguish what rank they used to come from was by their helmet. So the Snow Serpent still had a Snow Serpent helmet, and the Laser Viper still had a Laser Viper helmet. So since they gave us Snow Serpents and Range Vipers and Night Creepers and everything like that in the Modern Era line, if they had just taken those heads, painted them black, and put them on basically like a Snake Eyes torso, it would have worked. And again, that would have been a really cool box set to get, to have the whole Plague together. But unfortunately, we never got any of those guys. So kind of a bummer. Then in my number 7 spot, again, I've lumped a few together, but this is the Red Shadows. So the Red Shadows were the villains for G.I. Joe in the UK in the really early days. So in the UK, when they first started releasing G.I. Joe figures, they called them Action Force. And before they had released any of the Cobra figures, they had these villains called the Red Shadows. And they weren't produced by Hasbro, so they didn't have that same articulation. They were more like Kenner Star Wars figures. And they were soon wiped out and replaced with Cobra figures, even over in the UK. But there's still a fan base for the Action Force and the Red Shadows. And when Devil's Due was publishing the comic book, they actually introduced the Red Shadows into the American G.I. Joe mythology for the first time. And they gave us some named characters such as Wilder Vaughn, Della Eden, and Arthur Kulik. So I think any of those 3 people would have been really cool to get as figures. Again, I would have taken a whole box set, maybe give us those 3 characters and then just a bunch of Red Shadow troopers. But unfortunately, it was never meant to be. We did get one Red Shadow character. We got Red Laser from the Collectors Club, kind of in their last hurrah. But yeah, it's a shame we didn't get any more. In my number 6 spot, this one is not a super exciting character, but this is Clock Spring. And so he was G.I. Joe, kind of like I don't remember what his role was, but he was kind of like a desk G.I. Joe. He was not a combatant. And he was introduced in the G.I. Joe comic book published by IDW. It was the Cobra miniseries, which focused on Chuckles, the G.I. Joe undercover operative, kind of infiltrating Cobra. And it was just such a good comic book that a character like Clock Spring, who was kind of an overweight like G.I. Joe accountant or something, which would normally not be interesting at all, he actually had some really cool storylines and some cool scenes in the comic book that made me want a figure of him. So yeah, plus it would have been neat to get a character that was a different body size or something, because a lot of G.I. Joes, they all look like they're both the same height, same weight. So yeah, if they could actually come around to make a character that was a little overweight, that would have been kind of cool. So number 6 was Clock Spring. And at number 5, from the same series, the G.I. Joe Cobra series by IDW, I have Ronin, and she was very similar to Jinx, but yeah, she was a character that we never got, and she featured pretty prominently in those comic books. And yeah, if you go off and read those comic books, you'll become a fan as well, and you'll be wondering, why didn't we get a figure of Ronin? So yeah, that's why she's number 5. Number 4, I have another IDW creation, and this is Cobra Commander. Now, of course, we have Cobra Commander figures in the modern era. We have a lot of them. But in the Cobra series, the original Cobra Commander actually got assassinated, and then they replaced him with this trooper named Crake. And so they built up Crake as a character on his own before the assassination, and then he took over and became this new kind of ruthless version of Cobra Commander. So I would have liked figures of him in his Crake outfit as well as his kind of modified Cobra Commander outfit. Both would have been really cool. At number 3, I've got Firewall. So this was one of the G.I. Joe's kind of computer soldiers. She was introduced in the Devil's Due comic books. There was 2 of them. Mainframe was kind of the original G.I. Joe computer specialist. And then in Devil's Due, they introduced 2 young kind of apprentices for him, a male and a female. Firewall was the more interesting of the 2. And yeah, it's a shame we never got a figure of her. Number 2, I've got Ophelia. Now this was Snake Eyes' apprentice in the, I think it was still Devil's Due that was publishing the G.I. Joe comic book at this time, but they put out a miniseries called Master and Apprentice, and it focused on Snake Eyes having this female apprentice named Ophelia. It's been many, many years since I've read it, but they just really created an interesting character in the span of 4 issues. And yeah, I wanted a figure of her, never happened. And then my number 1 spot, this one might seem kind of weird, but I would have liked an action figure of Candy Apple. Now, Candy Apple, she was a character that was only around for a short time, and then she got killed. She was the girlfriend of the G.I. Joe character Ripcord. But we didn't get to see a whole lot of the G.I. Joe's personal lives in the comic books. And there was a storyline where Ripcord met this girl. She worked at like a circus, and she was wearing like a bear costume, and she went by the name Bongo the Bear. And he rescued her, and he found out she was actually a cute girl inside named Candy Apple, and they started dating, and her father was a Crimson Guardsman working for Cobra, and there was this whole elaborate thing, and eventually she got killed. I think it was Scrap Iron that blew her up with a bazooka. But yeah, I remember being pretty upset when she died in the comic books, and yeah, she would be a fun character to get. I don't know if she'd ever really make it on a retail shelf, but she would have been a fun add-in if there was a convention set or something. So, yeah, very unlikely to ever get a Candy Apple figure, but it'd be cool if we did. Okay, so those are my lists. Thank you for sitting through all of that. I hope you found it interesting. If you agree, if you disagree, let me know. I'm curious to hear which characters you think should have been on these lists. But really, all these lists are kind of moot at this point anyway, because when I created this list a year ago, the modern era was winding down, and it seemed like it was probably done. But there was always kind of a hope that, well, they're supposed to be doing another movie at some point. Maybe they'll bring it back then. But if you're a G.I. Joe fan, or even if you just watch my videos, you should know by now that there is a new line of 6-inch G.I. Joe figures called G.I. Joe Classified that are starting to roll out now. A lot of people online already have them. I've got mine on pre-order. So the modern era really is dead now. I imagine when the new movie comes out, we'll probably only get 6-inch figures, since that seems to be the scale that Hasbro is focusing on now. So now not only is the new Sculpt era label redundant, but the modern era label is also redundant, because the modern era is now the 6-inch classified figures. So maybe I'll have to do a list of the top classified figures that I'd like to see. But at this point, they've only revealed 5 figures so far, so that list would be pretty big. But who knows? If I'm still too sore to crawl around and look for toys, next week, maybe I'll do that video. So until then, thanks for watching, and yeah, stay safe. Ciao.